Welcome back. In this lecture, I want to finish up the discussion of seditious speech. Remember, seditious speech is speech that encourages rebellion against the government. In the last lecture, I talked about the Alien and Sedition Act of 1798, and I talked about the landmark case of Schenck versus the United States. Now, today, the discussion changes quite a bit in this third case. At first, the facts look very, very similar, but there are a couple of huge differences. So in the case of Gitlow versus New York in 1925, there are a couple of things that you should notice that are different between this case and Schenck. In the case of Schenck versus the U.S. government was involved. In this case, it's Gitlow versus New York, so the state of New York is involved. And the reason that's significant, remember, is that going all the way back to 1833 in Barron versus Baltimore, remember John Marshall's argument was that the Bill of Rights pertains only to the national government. Remember, in the Barron case, the city of Baltimore and the state of Maryland diverted those streams, and Marshall said, well, if the U.S. government had diverted those streams under the Fifth Amendment, you would have gotten compensation, Mr. Barron, but because it was the state, you don't get anything. And that's significant in this case, and I'll tell you why in just a second. So the basic facts of this case are, like Mr. Schenck, Mr. Gitlow is a left-wing agitator. In this case, Mr. Gitlow is a communist. He distributes leaflets, just like Mr. Schenck, urging workers to revolutionary mass action to achieve a dictatorship of the proletariat. If you're a little rusty on your Marxism, the proletariat would be the working class. In this case, he was arrested by New York authorities for violating a state law, not a federal law, the New York Criminal Anarchy Act of 1902. Now, Mr. Gitlow's attorney said that he shouldn't be convicted. The Supreme Court in the Schenck case said that during normal times, the leaflets would be protected. There is no wartime emergency. It's the 1920s. The state of New York makes a couple of arguments. The most noteworthy one is that if the U.S. government had arrested you for violating a law, yes, you would have had protection under the First Amendment. But the First Amendment speech rights does not pertain to us, the state of New York. We, the state of New York, we have the authority to ban, censor, or restrict any speech that we want. There are no limits as to our power. So there are a couple of interesting principles in this case. First of all, is the state of New York completely free to abridge the First Amendment or not? The second case, and the more immediate case, is should Mr. Gitlow go to prison for violating the New York Criminal Anarchy Act of 1902? So in your notes, there are a couple of things that are important in this case. The first is that the Supreme Court abandons clear and present danger. Remember, I told you in the last video that I really like this test. It demonstrates a wide latitude for free speech. The Supreme Court went to a much stricter standard for censorship in this case, with this notion that speech could be banned, censored, or restricted if it might lead to bad tendencies. And obviously, in this case, the Supreme Court ruled that this is communist propaganda. It might lead to bad tendencies. If you look at clear and present danger, I don't think these leaflets were a clear and present danger to anything. Now, what's underlined in your notes and what is most important about this case is that the Supreme Court for the first time incorporated freedom of speech in this case. In other words, the Supreme Court said that New York must respect speech rights to the same degree as the national government. Now, not very much. The Supreme Court ruled in this case that the speech could be banned, it could be censored, because we think it might lead to bad tendencies. But this case, even though right? There's an old saying, about winning the battle and losing the war. Well, in this case, civil libertarians lost the battle. Mr. Gitlow went to prison. I don't think he should have gone to prison. I would not have sent him there. But as a civil libertarian, what I think is important and what I like about this case is that old precedent from Barron versus Baltimore, that old 1833 precedent, which said that the Bill of Rights pertains only to the national government and is not applicable to the legislation of the states, that is overturned in this case. In the Gitlow case, the Supreme Court says that no, individuals have the same amount of civil liberties protection in the speech area, whether it is the national government or the states. So put multiple stars around the Supreme Court incorporated freedom of speech in this case, because that makes this a landmark ruling. This makes this one of the most important Supreme Court cases in the history of America. So it seems strange, right, that Schenck loses this case, and yet I'm extolling it as a victory for civil liberties. And the reason, of course, is because the Bill of Rights now begins applying to subnational governments. In this case, the state of New York, but cities as well. The last case that I want to talk about in the area of seditious speech is a case involving my least favorite group, the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. The case is Brandenburg versus Ohio. Charles Brandenburg is a local Klan leader. He notifies the local media in Cincinnati, Ohio, that they're going to have a Klan rally, that they're going to illuminate a cross. And as you might imagine, when the news media in Cincinnati finds out that there's going to be a Klan rally on a farm outside of Cincinnati, Ohio, the media knows, yep, we've got our lead story for the 11 o'clock news, and the local media shows up in force. Mr. Brandenburg engages in both hate speech and in seditious speech. So you have 2 for 1 in this case, and I'll just recite a few of the excerpts. Mr. Brandenburg begins the speech by saying, "Personally, I believe the Jew should be returned to Israel and the nigger should be returned to Africa." He then goes on to say that if the government, the Supreme Court, the President, and the Congress continue to suppress the white Caucasian race, there might need to be some revengeance taken. He then goes on to say that there's going to be a Klan rally in Washington, D.C. on July 4th. We need to march on Washington. We need to make our voices heard, and we need to return our government to our people. Now, armed with this film footage, the state of Ohio arrests and convicts Mr. Brandenburg. In this case, there was an Ohio law banning the duty, necessity, or propriety of crime, sabotage, or violence as a means of accomplishing political or industrial reform, and Mr. Brandenburg was fined and sentenced to prison. Now, Mr. Brandenburg's attorneys in this case said that this was pure speech, that the speech was not accompanied by any criminal conduct. There was no violence attached to this act. It was merely the advocacy of ideas, and that the government had prosecuted him merely because the government found his ideas offensive and disagreeable. So the case goes to the Supreme Court, and as you can see in your notes, the Supreme Court was highly divided in this case, 5-4. And perhaps surprisingly to you, what the Supreme Court did in this 5-4 decision was they overturned his conviction. Justice Douglas said, quote, "The threats were always loud but puny. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court permitted a climate of fear to overwhelm the First Amendment for many years." Now, this decision is important for a lot of reasons. First of all, it affirmed the notion that speech that was not accompanied by conduct is protected by the First Amendment. It demonstrates a very wide latitude for free speech in this particular case. Certainly, I think you could argue, and certainly I think if we use the standard that I mentioned in the last lecture, right? Remember Chief Justice Vinson, who said that there are some groups who are so dangerous that you don't have to wait for a revolution to start or for criminal conduct to occur. I think you could make the argument on the other side here that we know that the KKK, you might even call them a domestic terrorist organization, that the Ku Klux Klan engaged in numerous acts of terrorism, numerous lynchings. In my own case, I was hassled, as you may remember, by a couple of Klansmen back in 1975 in Kentucky. But in this particular case, what the Supreme Court ruled was that we are going to look at Mr. Brandenburg's conduct and the conduct of the people in the audience at that time. So even though this group has engaged in numerous atrocities in numerous places, in this particular case, the speech was not accompanied by any action at all. And in fact, you could make the argument on the other side, right, that in this particular case, Mr. Brandenburg, remember, said that there might need to be some revengeance taken, right, if government continues to ignore us. But what is revenge or revengeance? Certainly, it could be argued on the one side that Mr. Brandenburg said we need to march on Washington. We need, we basically need to elect people who are more sympathetic to our views. So you could argue that revenge or revengeance might be peaceful. On the other hand, the minority was highly concerned by the use of this word revengeance and believed that given the history of this particular hate group, that it certainly could be violent, it certainly could be terroristic, and that this individual should go to prison, even though in this particular case there was no action accompanying the speech. So this is a very interesting case. To me, what is most interesting is that the basic precedent in this case, that speech that is not accompanied by conduct has a wide berth, a wide latitude, and with only very, very minimal changes, the legal standard set in Brandenburg versus Ohio is still the law today. So to summarize seditious speech, right, it's speech that encourages rebellion against the government, that there has been a split between people who claim that you should go after groups that are dangerous and other people who say that don't worry about the group, look at individuals who belong to those groups and see if they're engaged in criminal conduct. We had the establishment of a very clear standard in clear and present danger in the Schenck case, which is still the most used legal standard in free speech cases. In Gitlow, what was significant about that case was that we have the incorporation of freedom of speech, that individuals are protected from both the power of the national government, the powers of states, and the powers of cities. And then in Brandenburg versus Ohio, the Supreme Court overturned the conviction of a Klansman, saying that the speech was not accompanied by conduct and therefore it was protected. This demonstrates a wide latitude for free speech that is still the current standard in the arena of seditious speech to this day. In the next lecture, I'm going to move out of seditious speech and move into the arena of symbolic speech. And symbolic speech is merely nonverbal speech that I would call freedom of expression. And we will talk about that next. Have a great day, everyone.